What is the power of a good question? Think in Romeo and Juliet, of Juliet asking, what's in a name? That which we would call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Or this question that Dr. Martin Luther King once said, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? Or when John F. Kennedy, calling upon the nation, our nation, to ask better questions, said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Questions have the power to deconstruct, reframe, change perspective, and question the status quo. Our story today is filled with questions between Jesus and the woman, in the minds of the disciples, although they don't speak them aloud, and a question from the woman to those who come to hear her testimony regarding Jesus. The conversation begins with a veiled question. In the translation we read this morning, Jesus asks, but if you read most translations, Jesus says to the woman, give me water. Even when we hear it in that context, give me water, there's still really a question presented to the Samaritan woman. We know Jesus well enough to know he's not going to force her to give him water, and so she has this choice. Will she, in the light of noonday for all to see, draw water for the Jewish man that stands before her? To us 21st century readers who will call Jesus our Messiah and Son of God, the answer might seem obvious. If Jesus asks for water, you give it to him. But when we ask some questions about the text, it quickly emerges that the woman's answer to Jesus' questions is not a sure thing. When we view the story through the lens of the ancient Near East, immediately questions begin to arise. Why are they at the well during midday instead of in the cool mists of morning and evening when most water was drawn? One interpretation has been that the woman is a fallen woman and must come in the heat of day to draw water because the other women of the village will have nothing to do with her. But does the text support this? As we ask questions of the text, there is no hint of this, actually. Perhaps the story is set at high noon so that the conversation between the woman and Jesus will be in the light. Unlike our story from last week, when a learned man of the law, Nicodemus, asked Jesus questions, like the woman does, but did it by the cover of night. So let's start with the setting. It's a great place to dive into this text and start asking our own questions. Noonday by a well. The gospel author, John, does not give us this detail about noonday for no reason. Like if we remember last week about Nicodemus, the Pharisee and religious leader, we were specifically told he came by the cover of night and the cover of darkness. And so just a few verses later in our text, we now have a story that takes place at the brightest part of the day. We could rest in that typical interpretation of why the woman is at the well at noon. Certainly many commentaries, sermons, and Bible studies, including some that I have taught and preached, assign meaning to the woman being at the well at noon because of her 5 husbands and the one she lives with who is not her husband. But asking questions of our faith, asking questions of the text often causes us to have to let loose of some things that we thought we knew and held and enter into what is really there. Certainly the cool mists of morning and the soft shadows of evening were more common times for drawing water, but when we examine the text, ask questions of it, we don't find any particular reason why she's there at midday. The text doesn't say she was there because she couldn't come at night. What we might infer from the text is that Jesus being at the well in the heat of the day means that he's thirsty. And when we look closer at the text referring back to the cloak of night that Nicodemus sought, we might wonder if this conversation takes place during the day as a sign that Jesus is not ashamed to be talking not to a woman who had 5 husbands, but to a Samaritan woman, which seems to be the more important detail of this woman's identity. The Samaritans and the Jews, as our narrator in our reading told us, are enemies. Other side of the tracks kind of enemies. Sharks and Jets kind of enemies. Montagues and Capulets kind of enemies. I'm right and you're wrong kind of enemies. When the woman asks Jesus, how can you, a Jewish man, ask water from me, a Samaritan woman? She is naming the divide that exists between these two groups of people. I love her directness. She's not going to pretend like this is a normal conversation. A man and a woman, a Jew and a Samaritan, in the height of day when all can see, she's going to call it for what it is. And this question she asks is a good question that begins to deconstruct the injustice and patterns of discrimination and long-held prejudices and biases that exist between these two groups of people. And it really actually begins with that question Jesus asks by asking her for water, and then the woman wondering how he can be bridging this gap. This conversation begins the process of bringing these two groups of people together. The conversation continues as Jesus tells her that if she knew who he was, she would ask him for living water. And then she says, with another good question, "Sir, where do you get this living water?" Again, she kind of names the truth, right? You don't even have a bucket. Where are you going to get this water? I think maybe, drawing water tended to be women's work. I think she's kind of like, you're not even prepared for this chore, right? Like, you did not come with a bucket. What are you, silly person, inferring that you can draw water without the right tools? She's unafraid, though, we see, to pose questions to him, to wonder at his teachings, and to seek further understanding. In our faith life, there's always tension between believing what we cannot fully understand and asking questions that seek illumination and probe into the mysteries of God. And Jesus seems to welcome the woman's questions, and their conversation goes on, resulting, as we heard, in the longest dialogue in the Gospel of John, and what ends up being an in-depth theological conversation. We might again contrast that with the conversation that Nicodemus and Jesus have, which could have been an in-depth theological conversation, should have been, right? This learned man who knows the law coming to Jesus, and instead Nicodemus gets caught up in ridiculous details and is trying to somehow pin Jesus down. And here, this Samaritan woman is the one who has perhaps one of the deepest theological conversation in the Gospels. If we were meant to have an unexamined faith, Jesus would have stopped the woman at her first question. "Woman, I said give me water, now draw some for me, and then I will give you living water. Don't ask me questions about what this living water is, just take it." But that's not what we find here, is it? And perhaps this dialogue between Jesus and the woman is itself part of the living water that Jesus has to offer. Our faith can bring us to life. And as Jesus says, it then bubbles over in us so that we might have living water to share with others. And certainly we see that in the woman, right? She has this conversation with Jesus, asks questions, learns more, and then she has faith to share with others as she goes into the village to tell other Samaritans about this man she has met. But the living water that Jesus describes in this story might be more than just about the faith of this individual woman. She is a Samaritan, and the text goes to such pains to remind us of this that we are never given her actual name. She is always identified as the Samaritan woman. So let's circle back for a moment to the setting of the story. It is set at noonday, yes, but there's another detail about the setting. Where does it take place? It takes place in, I'm hearing different answers. It takes place in Samaria and at a well, right? The woman at the well, right? So, again, with our 21st century eyes, we might just think a well, a place for water. But wells have deep spiritual significance, particularly in the Hebrew texts that, of course, Jesus would have known. The setting of the well echoes places of betrothals throughout the Hebrew scriptures. Particularly, it echoes the setting of Rachel and Jacob's betrothal, which also happens at a well in the heat of the day. Our story of the woman and Jesus at the well does not end in a marriage, but it does end with the woman wondering if Jesus might be the Messiah. And it causes Jesus to respond with an I am statement. It didn't come out super clear in the translation we read. But throughout the Gospel of John, there are these I am statements, 7 of them, where Jesus reveals who Jesus is to the people. And the I am statements echo God's revelation to Moses as Moses prepares to lead the people out of slavery and into the new life of being the nation of Israel and the people of God. I am, is God saying to Moses, I am all that you can imagine and more. I am the one who will be with you, who will not forsake you, who will bind myself to your fate, and who will make a covenant with you. Really, there's echoes of marriage between God and God's people in the I am statement and God's faithfulness to the people as time goes on. And if this story does not end with a traditional sort of marriage, there is still a bringing together of two groups of people in the Jews and the Samaritans of the story. And a revelation that Jesus is the I am, a fulfiller of the covenant, still bound to the people. If we think back to that question I started with, when Juliet says, what is in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. We see in the story of Romeo and Juliet how these two young people who fall in love, even though they both will die, spoiler alert if you haven't seen, right? We all know that. They do get married, but it's really actually their death that ends up bringing these two families together. After the death of Romeo and Juliet, these two families cannot find reason to maintain the feud that has spanned generations. We see not a marriage between Jesus and the woman, but a binding together of these two groups of people who have considered themselves enemies of the other. As Jesus comes to the Samaritan woman, and then the Samaritan woman goes and preaches to her people about who this might be. The Messiah, the I am, the keeper of the covenant, the God with us, has not just come for the Jewish people, but has also come for the Samaritans, right? And so when we take this story and make it about more than just this woman, suddenly we see that something miraculous is going on here. And so then the living water that Jesus offers becomes the presence of God with the Jewish people, with the Samaritan people, a God of reconciliation who does not recognize the boundaries of society, but transcends and transforms, which is symbolized by the bringing together of the Jews and the Samaritans in this story. The living water is the relationship with a God who comes to us as we are, whether that be a woman, a Samaritan, a questioner, somebody with 5 husbands, Nicodemus, a Pharisee who comes in the night. The living water is a God who comes to us and a God who knows us. This woman with her 5 husbands and now the one that is not her husband is a detail in this story that matters, although maybe not the way we have traditionally interpreted it. We talk about this woman sometimes. There's all kinds of ways we talk about her. We assign her things that are not in the scripture. We guess that she might be a prostitute sometimes, or certainly just at least a fallen woman. We think she's there at midday because she's disgraced. We wonder at her 5 husbands and the one who is not her husband who lives with her. And we assume that they're living together in sin. But we don't know because the text doesn't tell us. In the ancient Near East, people died young all the time. She might have just had the misfortune of 5 husbands who died before she did. Or in the ancient Near East, her husband could have divorced her and she would have had no choice. So even if she's divorced, it would have been her husband's choice, not hers. And there is a tradition even among the Samaritan people of levirate marriage, where if your husband died, a relative in your family was required to marry you. And so perhaps as her husbands have died, whether she wanted to remarry or not, these relatives have stepped forward. Perhaps she's living with one who is not her husband because she's run out of relatives to marry her and now has to live, right? 5, that's a lot. There's like no more uncles. And so now maybe she's living in a household with somebody who cannot marry her. Also, in the Roman world, if you had been an enslaved person, even if you were set free, you could not legally marry. And so she might be living with somebody who cannot marry, even if they wanted to. The truth is, we just don't know. It all makes for a great story, right, about the power of grace and the opportunity for new life if she really were a sinful woman. But the text doesn't support it. Jesus, when he encounters people that he identifies as sinful, and he does identify people as sinful and welcome sinners, he will say this himself, I welcome sinners, right? These are words he proclaims about himself. But he will not beat around the bush. He will name it, right? And he usually says things like, go and sin no more, repent and turn back, right? He doesn't leave sin unnamed. And we do not see him in this text naming her sin at all, which would leave us to wonder about those interpretations that even I've promoted, which for me reminds me that asking good questions of the text is always an opportunity to learn and grow in our faith and our understanding of who God is and who Jesus is. And so, that story about the redemption of a sinful woman is a great story about one woman finding grace and a new life. But what if this story is so much bigger? And it's about Jesus folding in an entire people and saying this feud that has gone on is now over, because in me we will be united. And I come as the great I am, the one who is not just for the Jews, but for all. That's a much more powerful story, isn't it? Jesus is changing everything here. The details of the story are important because they lead us to ask questions about what Jesus is up to. And then they lead us to have to ask questions about our own faith. If I walk away from this story and what I believe is Jesus has redeemed a sinful woman, it's a beautiful story, and I'll know I can turn to Jesus to find new life when I make a mistake. And there are plenty of stories that will tell me that very same thing. But if I leave this story and what Jesus is saying is we are going to deconstruct the feud that happens between groups of people, and we're going to do it with curiosity and questions and grace, well, that sends me out into the world with a whole different set of marching orders if I want to follow this man. This means that instead of looking people and relying on my assumptions, I need to get curious. And instead of believing what the world tells me I should believe about people who are different than me, this story tells me that I should come with humility and curiosity and a desire to learn. And this story tells me that the living water is about bringing people together, not dividing people apart. I think in many ways this story leaves us with more questions than answers. Even the woman herself has questions after she leaves Jesus, right? She's sure enough about Jesus that she's willing to start telling others, but she still has questions. She says in her evangelism, I have met a man who told me everything I have ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he? Isn't it so interesting that she's still asking questions? Her evangelism essentially is a question in and of itself. Is he the Messiah? Don't we sometimes feel like we cannot begin to tell other people about Jesus unless we have all the answers to all the questions? But what if our evangelism looked like just surfacing the questions we have about our own faith so that we can all sit in the wonder and the curiosity together? Her question is enough to draw people in and prompt them to come and see. And we are told that many believed because of the woman's testimony, but many more believed because of what they heard when they came to Jesus and he spoke to them. It's okay to leave the text with questions, and it's good to have questions as a part of our faith journey and a part of our life. The questions between Jesus and the woman draw two enemy groups together, and they find conversation, connection, and a binding together. Questions have the power to deconstruct our stereotypes, our biases, and the social norms that separate us from other people. We can find the living water when we are curious about others instead of allowing our preconceived notions to be the narrative we live by. And our faith life needs questions too. We often think about questions separating us from God. If we doubt, if we ask, it will mean that we don't have enough faith. But this story tells us that questions can actually draw us towards the very heart of God and help us discover the God who is with us in our doubts as much as in our certainty. Amen.